Hello, my name is Shervana Anderson Bird, and I'm the Regional Director of the California Reading and Literature Project at UCLA. Welcome to the Reading Warrior Series, an opportunity for scholars and experts in their field to come and share their knowledge of reading for our K-12 students. The California Reading and Literature Project is a professional organization focused on professional development in language, literacy, and social justice. Today, we're honored to have Maryanne Wolf with us, a scholar, teacher, and advocate for children and literacy around the world. She is currently the director of the newly created Center for Dyslexia, Diverse Learners, and Social Justice at UCLA in the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies. Maryanne Wolf has authored several books, many which might be on your shelves, such as Proust and the Squid, The Story of Science of Reading and the Brain, or Dyslexia, Fluency, and the Brain, Tales of Literacy for the 21st Century, and her more recent book, Reader Come Home, The Reading Brain in a Digital World. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Maryanne Wolf, and I hope you enjoy the information that she brings to share with us.
Well, hello to all of you. It's a pleasure. It's a special pleasure to do anything that has as its title reading and literature. For those of you who are ex-English majors like myself, before neuroscience came 2 degrees in English literature. And so it's such a joy actually for me to know that you're involved in all of this and with our shared goal of working with our various students. And when I say various, I truly mean all the diverse students that we work with. I'm at the Center for Dyslexia, Diverse Learners, and Social Justice, where we have a very simple, universal, but very, at the same time, complicated mission, which is we want literacy to be considered a basic human right everywhere, not just in our neighborhoods, not just in our state, not just in our country, but globally. So we are working literally across every zip code and in almost every continent except Antarctica with some of our projects on literacy. And I work with Dr. Laura Reinhardt and Dr. Rebecca Gottlieb and Veronica Pedrosa and Trang Nguyen at our center. Now, before I zoom in on the specifics that Shervana wanted me to speak about, which is the early work, I want to situate our work for you, not just for those of you who are if you will, as Emily Dickinson calls it, my select society today, but for various people who might hear this talk. We want to situate our work at the center within a very much broader schema, because what we're doing is using cognitive neuroscience research, especially on the reading brain and on dyslexia, as a lever, as our way, our lens on how can we teach and do a better job of releasing the potential of all children. So our children with dyslexia and other reading challenges are our vehicle for helping all children. And we will talk about what dyslexia is or is not. But very importantly today, our emphasis will be how can we predict those at risk for having a reading challenge, and what can that information do to help us provide ever more targeted intervention. So we'll be really zooming in on what does that mean, and we will be doing it by using the lens of cognitive neuroscience and education. It's always this great translation process, and it's a reciprocal. It's Shervana said it in some of her early remarks a few minutes ago. What we're talking about is how research and practice have this reciprocal relationship, and how we who do research on some questions have to see how do they live in the real life of a classroom, and what does the classroom teacher in particular, or the specialist, or the leadership, or educators who are doing policy, how do the findings that we provide, how do they live in situ, in the real settings? And how then does their implementation raise completely new sets of questions for us in research? So it's a true reciprocity between what we do in the research world and how it's implemented, and what are the questions that are constantly on the minds of teachers and educators and policymakers. Now, today I'm actually going to situate you with a few big questions before zooming in on our specific outcome for today. And the first one is, how in the world does the brain learn to read, and what is the kind of information we bring to bear? And why is it important for this question on early assessment and early intervention? Well, my colleague in Paris, Stanislas Dehaene, said this, that parents and educators must have a better understanding of what reading changes in the child's brain. I'm convinced that increased knowledge of these circuits will greatly simplify the teacher's task. And that's, if you will, the first few minutes of today. It's going to sound like neuroscience 101, but it's really providing the platform for understanding that all the work I'm going to be talking about is an extension of what we have been learning over the last 2 decades about how the brain, which was never meant to read, nothing in your brain was equipped with a gene that was going to unfold and make a child read. No, that's our job. But the brain's job is to use its design principles to take its component parts. And if you look at this diagram of the brain, you'll see that it's got all these circles. Each circle represents a set of very important processes that are genetically programmed. Language, we've got all these regions set up, vision, cognition, affect, it's all set up, but it is not connected for reading. And that's what you and I do. You and I are the connectors, if you will, for making the component parts of the brain work together in order to make a brand new circuit. Now, this circuit has both an Achilles heel and an Achilles shield. The shield is that because it's plastic, it can learn how to read in any language. And if you look at the brains of different speakers of different languages, let's say Chinese and Japanese kanji, that requires different emphases in the circuit that an English or an alphabet speaker doesn't need as much. So if you look at this quick diagram, it's just an example, just a tiny example of the fact that your reading brain circuit is unique to each person. It's going to be unique to the writing system, but, and here's where you come in, it is going to reflect the particular emphases of how you teach. Now, it's not for today's talk, but I've written a book called Reader Come Home, The Reading Brain in a Digital World, all about the fact that that reading brain circuit changes when it reads, as you and I do, 5 to 12 hours a day on a screen. Screen reading is different from print reading. And though the differences can be subtle, they can be very large. That's for another talk, not today. Today's talk is simply about how the young brain learns to read and what that can do to help us assess and intervene in better ways. Now, there's no question that there are two stories. There are more than two stories. There are many, many stories. But the two biggest stories are the children who come from very language privileged homes and those for whom the environment for language is not privileged. And there's a Matthew effect, if you will, where the rich in language get richer and the poor get poorer. Now, what am I meaning by that? And it's really important for you when we think of assessment and intervention to realize from the start that what happens between infancy and 5 years is as important as what happens in the next 5 years for many children. And the reason is the brain is representing information and knowledge. And when we say represent, think of the word as represent. And the more it's exposed, the more there's a consolidated representation of the sounds of the language, the phonemes, of how words in whatever the first language, or if the child is bilingual, whatever that first home language is, make it rich, make it full, make it, elaborated. That's what the parent from the language privileged homes is doing. They're giving multiple exposures to words. So when we talk about the 0 to 5 period, we're really talking about developing the components of the reading brain before it ever gets connected in terms of the sounds, in terms of how reading works. And what I don't mean decoding. I mean, how does a book work? How does written language look to a child? And in the particular languages that go left to right or right to left, up or down? Do words stay the same on a page? All these conventions are part of what the child is beginning through 0 to 5 to incorporate. Now, you've probably heard more about phonemes than anything else when we talk about those early components, and there's a good reason. And that is because the essence of decoding is to put a phoneme with a letter, the sound with the letter. Letter sound correspondence rules are part of the foundation. But you're not going to hear me say there's only one piece that's important to foundation. In fact, you're going to have me expand for some of you your very conceptualization of foundational skills, so that phonemes occupy a really important part of that. But so also in importance is the semantic development of every child. The semantic development will be a piece of what goes into not just assessment, but intervention as well. So many of our children who are multilingual are not sufficiently developing their first language so that they have this rich platform. Words are the foundation and the mediation between what is thought, a concept, and how it's expressed. And every single book, that's why I love the title Reading and Literature, every single book that is read to a child has an impact on the vocabulary, on the syntactic development, on knowing how written language works. Now, I know that this slide has been shown by, probably Shervana has shown it to you before, but it's such an old slide that you'd think I would get rid of it after 1,000 times I've given it. Never. I use it to expose any new person to the concept of the gap that exists between those children. Remember the two stories, those children who hear words over and over and over again and are able to represent them in their brain, versus children who don't hear words over and over again. And this gap, whether we call it 32 million or 30 million, there's all kinds of studies, including some done by my colleagues at MIT using brain imaging. We are finding these differences matter so much. So these older studies have been replicated in terms of qualitative growth and neuroimaging, and the findings are always the same. Children who hear words more are representing them, and these representations show up in the activation of their brain. And my colleagues in pediatric neurology who study this from the standpoint of brain imaging show that the kids who get read to day after day, or as I like to think, night after night, that beautiful daily ritual that calms a parent, calms a child, and takes place under the crook of an arm. I love that moment as one of the most beautiful moments, not just for cognition and language to develop, but also for affective association. But just from the imaging standpoint, just take a look at this slide and you will see that not only do the receptive language areas become more activated in the child who's read to, but also the expressive. Now, when we put all of these different parts together, around 5, and what you're seeing are different parts of the brain representing phonemes, orthographic letter recognition, all this. Well, the brain has all these parts, and our job is twofold in this talk. One is to say you have to know what those parts are like if you are going to get if you will, a heads up on who needs what in their first grade intervention. So this slide is actually just a representation of the parts that we're going to ultimately assess and look at, not through brain imaging, but through very simple tests and tasks in a screener. But that's getting just a little ahead of my story, because my story is also about reading and literature. It's about deep reading processes. And even though I'm only going to really just give you a few minutes, I want to do that for almost every talk. And I write about this in my last book, Read or Come Home, because it's so important for us, especially you who are interested in literature, to know that these broad-based foundational skills are always talking about not just phonemes and graphemes, but the meanings of words, the functional syntactic uses of words, and how they come together in sentences, and how the sentences come together to give us meaning and purpose and beauty in life, and empathy. And that's what the real story is of deep reading. Deep reading is when you take a decoding brain circuit and make the parts fast enough. Now remember this, because it's going to come in a few minutes to our talk about intervention. You have to get the foundational skills fluent or automatic enough so that that decoding circuit, that first circuit, can allocate time to putting the deep reading processes in the circuit. So the circuit begins very basically and then becomes steadily ever more elaborated with these deep reading processes. And they include background knowledge, what the child knows. Go back to 0 to 5. If the child doesn't have a lot of language and therefore not a lot of conceptual background knowledge, it's harder to understand what words mean. Comprehension is harder. So understanding the importance of background knowledge and its development in the first 5 years is so important. And what we're doing in especially these early stories that we are reading to children, and I just love that Shirvana is now working on social emotional development and literature for the K2 area. These are the stories that build. I would like to say they build empathy. They build the ability of a child. Actually, I want to go back and use the term. They build perspective taking. They build a child's knowledge of what another thinks and feels. Frog and Toad, George and Martha, all these beautiful characters, Charlotte and Wilbur, all these characters are going outside themselves to help another because they are beginning to understand that others think, others feel. And that's a piece of what are, if you will, the building blocks of deep reading. And that's part of um, our task in social justice. And I know that Shervana and I share, we even call, ourselves reading warriors because social justice is a piece of our work. We live in an interconnected world where others are so important. And these early skills, whether it's 0 to 5 or the stories between 5 and 10 and then on, are teaching us who others are. And I use this quote from the great novelist Marilynne Robinson in her interview with Barack Obama. And she said, the trend towards seeing those different as sinister other is the greatest danger to continuing our democracy. This is our job as social justice activists as well. People might have begun this talk thinking, oh, I'm going to be talking about assessment and intervention. Yes, part of that work is ensuring that we have children who are developing these deep reading brains, because that's the basis of critical analysis, empathy, novel thought, all of this. And it takes years to form, and it takes you and me milliseconds, extra milliseconds to use. I wish I were giving you a talk on how you're changing. I'm not. There are other talks that you can have access to on some of our websites, but we are all changing, and you must always, this is for you, this is my parents for you. You must never shortchange your own ability to allocate time to critical analysis and empathy. But this is my talk on dyslexia and assessment, so I can't give you more than a parent. But now I want to connect you to whether you call it neurodiversity or cerebral diversity. I use the term cerebral diversity to describe the fact that you and I have brains that are about 50,000 years old. Now, how many of you know how old literacy is? Give or take a few, you're going to say around 5,000, 6,000 years. Yeah, blink in the eye. Now, the fact that we had different brains preceded the invention of literacy. In other words, the dyslexic brain wasn't dyslexic before we invented literacy. It was just a different organization of the brain that was necessary. That's why you have great artists, inventors, generals, entrepreneurs, and at the bottom of this list, you see this name, Ben Wolf Noah. And I want you to look behind me. Do you see this fabulous piece of art behind me? That's by the artist Ben Wolf Noah. Now, if you're using your inferential processes, you will have noticed that the name Wolf is in that name. That's my son. So I am speaking to you as not only a researcher in dyslexia, but as a mother, which has helped me no end. Now, I'm going to say just 2 minutes, and using probably the most brilliant mind in the last 1,000 years, or one of them. And I have no doubt in my mind that if I had a time machine, I would go back and I would find that Leonardo da Vinci was dyslexic. He could not read quickly. He wasn't able to go to the school he wanted or his father wanted because he couldn't learn Latin. He couldn't retrieve words. Now, I'm not saying this is an English-speaking person who can't learn Latin, but an Italian speaker. This is one of the hallmarks of dyslexia, or retrieval issues. There's a lot of different reasons, but I'm only going to give you one half a minute on this. But just as an example of the fact that in our diverse learners, and dyslexia is one of our preeminent cases, they are a mix of strengths and weaknesses, and that's what our interventions and our assessments have to be able to point out. Now, Leonardo da Vinci was fantastic in geometry. He was terrible in algebra. He was fabulous in art, but some of the handwriting that you see is curiously different. He was a problem solver, but when asked what he most wanted in life, it was to have someone who would just stand beside him to read to him. This is this is something that we see in so many of our adults and individuals with dyslexia who have different kinds of weaknesses, but very similar strengths in visual problem solving, analogy making, a lot of spatial strengths. But we have a lot of misperceptions about dyslexia, like it's a reversal. If I ever hear another dog god joke, I'm just going to regurgitate. This is not the real story of dyslexia, reversal. What you see is this clustering of relative weaknesses and relative strengths. Now, we know without any doubt that one of the predominant ones is a weakness in processing phonology and phonemes. But there's only 20 to 25% who have only that. Many of them have what are called naming speed issues. Think Da Vinci, he couldn't retrieve those words. Well, think of that circuit. The speed with which the parts have to come together has to be automatic. If it's not, you're going to have more laborious reading. So you frequently can take a look inside the brain by looking at naming speed tasks, and I'll show you one of them in a let me just go quickly and show you what that looks like. On the right here, you see what a naming speed looks like test. You're just asking the child to say the same old letters over and over again, but speed with which they are moving from letter to letter. This total speed is going to give you an indication of whether or not they have retrieval speed issues. But this slide is to really portray something else that is going to be the basis for our discussion on both assessment and intervention. You see all these relative strengths. Now, one of them is IQ. We used to even have these awful ways of saying the discrepancy between IQ. Forget those kinds of definitions of dyslexia. But do not forget that by and large, a lot of our children with dyslexia have two things that are at war. One, they can't do what other kids seem to do, which they consider a sign of smartness or intelligence. Learning to read and so they think they're dumb. One of the things all of you, and everybody you touch in your teaching must get rid of that connection between not being able to read as a sign of a lack of intelligence. In my world, one of the first things I have to demythologize is that connection. If anything, many of our kids are even more talented and gifted, but it's more like a bell-shaped curve of intelligence that's the same as everybody else's. But it's not the case that dyslexia has anything to do with a lack of intelligence. And we have to ensure that one of these traits in the social emotional category, resilience, we have to ensure that our children are resilient as they get our interventions. So we're doing a lot of different work looking at all of this over time. And if you put so much of this together, you'll get two major predictors. One is phoneme awareness, one is naming speed. But I want you to just take a quick look at naming speed on those same brains that we had horizontally. Well, now let's look at them like this vertically, and you'll see that the brain of some, not all, some of our children, and you can look at it through the naming speed lens, but they're holding on to the information in their right hemisphere that needs to be going over the what's called the splenium into the left hemisphere and get hooked up. They're holding on to it. They're trying to process it because they're really good at processing visually, but they're not good at sometimes getting this information connected. So that right hemisphere often, not in all, but in some of our kids, is literally trying to do the work of the left hemisphere. And in the process, it's causing delays and it's causing differences in our children. And the naming speed task is simply a way of us looking to see whether or not that's happening, whether the system is not hooked up as automatically as it should be or it must be in order to learn to read. Now we've got a paradox going on here, which is why I've done all this research on assessment in the first place. And the reality is I am sick and tired. I am exhausted sometimes with emails from parents and educators across the country who say, my child is, and then fill in the blanks. My child is 10. My child is third grade. My child is fourth grade. My child is fifth grade. And was never diagnosed with dyslexia until now they are suspicious. This is truly unfortunate that identification is often so long in coming that the child is suffering the social emotional sequelae of feeling they're a failure and not getting any help until third and fourth grade, and sometimes not even then. Now, that's number one. Number two is the fact, and we've done research from National Institute for Child Health and Human Development on this aplenty, the fact that early intervention is more efficacious. So, as Nadine Gabb calls it, we've got a paradox. We've got many children not getting diagnosed till later, and yet we know early intervention is best. So, what do? Well, here's where we get to the nub of my talk. My last PhD student, Ola Ozernov-Palchik, she's now at the Harvard Reading Lab, but she was, during her dissertation, part of a group. This was her dissertation, but it was part of a big group. John Gabrielle at MIT, Nadine Gabb at Children's, who's also at Harvard right now, Elizabeth Norton, myself. We all were involved in a huge predictive study of 5-year-olds all throughout New England. Every kind of school child is represented in this study. And all we wanted to do was say, are there risk factors that will, and tasks, a few, that will predict profiles? You can call them subtypes if you're more interested in neuroscience category, language, or you can just say different profiles of kids. Well, what we found is that there are important skills. I'm going to go actually back one more time. There are important skills that we can test at 5 that can predict risk. IQ is not one of them. Phonological awareness is definitely one. Working memory is one. RAS, naming speed is one. Letter sound knowledge is one. And vocabulary is another. The next group, if you see it, I'll show it to you. But basically, you've got this big group of, kids who are high performers, and then you have this middle group of kids who are average. Now, the perspicacious members of this audience, wherever you are, might say, well, okay, you said these high performers and you said these guys who are average, but what about this green group that looks average if not gifted? There's no significant difference between them except this plummeting score in RAN. Now you have to know that these kids seem like everybody else unless you had in your battery a naming speed task. Only then would you see that you have a major risk factor for later fluency issues. Not going to show up as decoding. They're going to decode. but they're going to be decoding slower. And you're going to say, oh, usually he, in many of our cases, he's going to develop out of it. He or she is not going to develop out of this naming speed issue. This is a retrieval issue that's located in the speed in which the brain component parts get connected. Now, they're the invisible ones who sometimes never get diagnosed till high school, sometimes not till college. I've had many a college student. In fact, this is the Da Vinci Code, if you will. This is I've never said this before to anyone. This is the Da Vinci decoder. He's decoding, but slowly. And it won't show up until it's way too hard. Like in the college kids who get diagnosed, only get diagnosed if they do at all, because the amount of material they have has just crashed their natural compensatory mechanisms. They're compensating because they're smart, they're they look like they're pretty good in everything else, and so they get by, or they get by very well until they crash. This is the fluency kids who are invisible. The red line is a group of kids who seemed to be just a little low performing across the board, but they're not hardcore enough. So you say, who are they? Well, they're a motley group, but a lot of them have language issues, and they show up in the letter sound knowledge. Some of them have language delays, some of them have language deprivation in their environment, but they are a motley group that we have to still consider at risk. Then these two blue guys, these are the ones who over time, look at this one, this is just our multi-deficit. By first grade, you just see they are not. They're doing poorly across the board. That's our multi-deficit group. This other group, which has phonological issues and short-term memory issues, they're okay in these other areas, just they do poorly, go back here, they do poorly in working memory and phonological awareness. But their RAN is fine, their letter sound knowledge actually isn't, so it looks more average. These two blues we will catch. We will not catch the green almost ever, and the red we never know for sure what to do with. But these stay stable across time. What do we do about them? That's the whole point of what is an Office of Special Education grant, which we call TEDdy, towards early differential intervention. And it begins with doing what we did in that predictive study with over 1,300 kids, but we're doing it with screeners. So our first job is to test out different digital screeners. I'll show you an example. To train our teachers in a couple of different schools. We're in the UCLA Lab School, we're at Chime, and we're Fernangeles right now. We may add schools, but those are the ones that we are most interested in. And what we're doing, we are screening them on the first screener that we're using is called Early Bird. Now we're also going to screen on a literacy screener from UCSF. We're going to test it as well in the lab school. But basically we're looking at rapid automatized naming, letter sound, correspondence rules, phoneme blending, vocabulary. We're looking at a screener that can give games that the child, let's say, is given sort of like a Peabody and is able to tell us receptively what that test is measuring. In this case was vocabulary. But what we're basically doing is saying, can we find those profiles with a digital screener of those major component tasks? And we are luckily finding those profiles in our kids. So we're getting some of the very same groups with a digital screener that we got with a much longer elaborated paper and pencil. Now we're going to do this with the UCSF screener. They have very similar tasks, just slightly different game format. But what we want to do is this is the first data that we are, almost no one has seen these data. But what we're doing is we're looking at our high, average, and average kids. We're looking at the kids who have phonology. We're looking at the kids who have RAN. And we're looking at the kids who have what we would call double deficit or even triple deficit. Though we combine those, they are multi-deficit kids. Now, what do we do about that? That's where it gets more interesting. So what we're trying to do is match the subtype with an intervention that will go after the particular weaknesses and strengths of our students. So when we have a multi-deficit group, we're giving a combination of a very systematic, explicit phonics, phoneme awareness type program. In this case, we're using Wilson. In other times, we've used Project Read or Gillingham. But in this case, in this study, we're using Wilson plus a program which I'm going to talk to you about in a minute or two, which is called RAVO. For the children who have only phoneme awareness, we're giving them heavy duty phonics. They have their normal classroom routines and language arts, but we're giving extra work in an explicit phonics. Now remember, the double deficit or multi-deficit kids are getting two programs pulled together. If our children are only having issues in fluency, then we're giving them largely RAVO. We're not giving them any extra explicit phonics. So you can see what we're doing is we are, if you will, managing the children who have no expected dyslexia risk with those who have phonology risk, with those who have a fluency risk or the double or triple threat. Now, I'm going to say something that steps on maybe one or two toes. The world has had an unnecessary debate. It is not a great debate. It is a pitiful debate. It is a pitiful, if you will, unfortunate, and I think anachronistic reading war between phonics, whole language, balanced literacy. There should never have been a war. There should always be a look at how the reading brain develops these skills and pulls them together. And so what we have done in our intervention work for over 2 decades is we took the reading brain seriously and we created tests, if you will, or research on programs that gave emphases across the board in our foundational skills. So we wanted to have programs, and RAVO is the one that I'll talk about, but another one is Empower by my Toronto colleague, Maureen Lovett. All this work is done by Maureen Lovett, myself, and Robin Morris from Atlanta. And what we were trying to do is say, with our children, will explicit emphases on not just phoneme awareness and phonics, but always have it in there, will we be able to do an even better job by adding these extra emphases on semantic development, on syntactic development, on morphological development? So I'm just giving you an example. I never ever, no matter whether it's, I didn't even tell you that Martha Dinkle and I published the RAN years ago. There are multiple naming speed tasks. And by the same token, I'm not saying you should do this naming speed task or this reading program. I'm talking about principles of measurement, principles of intervention. And so I'm using Ravo because I know it best, but the principle here is that we're teaching multi-components of reading and connecting them, not doing a little here, a little there. We're every single day connecting phonology to orthography, to semantics, to syntax, to morphemes, to sentences and stories. Every 2 days, everything is connected. And we use metacognitive strategies. I'll only give you one or two here. Ms. Mim, uh, I kind of had Bette Midler in my mind, the divine Ms. Mim, Ms. M, or well, I mean, Ms. Mim stands for many interesting meanings. Now, it's really the linguistic term polysemy that she's teaching. Polysemy is the fact that especially 40% of our primer type words have multiple meanings, and the kids don't know it. Teachers aren't taught polysemy, and yet children can be better prepared to read a multiple meaning word if you have a fun metacognitive strategy like Ms. Mim, who teaches kids that every word, not every word, excuse me, words can have as many meanings as she has legs. So we call words like pat and bat and sap and tap and all these words with meanings like that mem words. And then we give stories, which are called minute stories, in which some of our characters from Rainbow Town track the tracks by the tracks. We have terribly, you wouldn't know that I have 2 degrees in English literature when you read some of our stories, but believe you me, they help them with semantic agility, with semantic flexibility, with syntactic knowledge to know that an S can be a plural or it can be a verb meaning at the present time. So we are teaching these concepts, if you will, in fun ways. Now, the results are whether you use Empower, which is a wonderful multi-component program by Maureen Lovett, whether you use Ravo or Empower, you get better results than if you only use a strictly by the books explicit phonics program. Now, we never not use phonics. We always are explicit, but we are explicit about everything. And what we see is that we get truly better intervention. Now, in our OSEP grant, the new one, and I only wish, Shervana, that we had the intervention begun. It's only beginning right now. But what we want to prove is that we can do even better by teaching a subtype, a particular set of emphases. In this case, we gave everybody who was at risk a multi-component intervention. And indeed, 75% of all the kids who are dyslexia have multi-components, if you will. So we did no disservice to children, but we think we can even do better by our even more targeted intervention. But now, if you remember, I talked about the terrible paradox of diagnosing late. Well, we can just show you right here that when you diagnose late, you can still make good impact, but you make much better impact when you begin early. And that's really one of the major, if you will, points of my whole lecture to you today. Early, good assessment based on research, good targeted intervention that is evidence-based, but that is begun in first grade, not much later. Now we have all these beautiful linguistic cognitive reading measures, and the kids, you know, I have to say they have done extraordinarily well in their findings. But our Italian colleagues have shown that it's not just our academic performance that improves, but also our social emotional. And there's a translation of Rainbow that's called Eureka in Italian, and they show that all these wonderful social emotional skills and processes and sense of well-being are improving as a result of the intervention. Now, the last things I want to say is that, of course, not all our kids who struggle are dyslexic. And we are finding one study after another that SES, the socioeconomic status, is so correlated with how many kids struggle the most. And it is these kids are not dyslexic, but they are struggling because they did not, in that 0 to 5 period, have everything that we want our entire society to have. And then we look at the NAEP scores and who's proficient and who's not proficient. And remember when I said there are two stories? Well, there are multiple stories. But one of the stories is who are our children who are struggling to reach proficiency in 4th grade and who are struggling to even get basic. And so many of our African American kids, especially boys, are not doing well at grade 4. And our Hispanic or Latino kids are not doing as well as they should in grade 4. My very fine colleague, Sean Robinson, who just look up Dr. Dyslexia Dude. He has these comic books that are really after African American boys in particular. And he has a TEDx talk recently on this. But he and I are looking at the forgotten boys. 4th grade, smart, struggling, and doomed to failure because nobody got them to that fluent, proficient, and sometimes even basic level by grade 4. We can't accept this. And so I want to end with saying, I want systemic change in the whole system. Shervana and I are reading warriors. Anna Marie Francois, our whole group. Carol Yakel. We're all in this as warriors because we want a campaign to increase language and conceptual development between 0 and 5. We want no more gaps. We want all our kids read to, talked to, sung to. So another talk is on music, but it's very related to the time that it takes for us to appreciate rhythm. Some of the same processes are involved in the time to process phonemes. So singing, talking, reading to our 0 to 5 is essential. Second point of these talks or these outcomes of this talk, we need early assessment. The screener looks good that we're using, and we hope that there will be other screeners that are equal to it. We'll be testing the UCSF one with the lab school this year and other around all of California. But we know we need early assessment and we need teachers trained to use assessment to get our kids ever more targeted interventions in 1st grade. Finally, I want fluency by 4th grade, and if we don't get it, we have to have all our teachers trained from 4th grade on, not just K3, but K12. And we need our juvenile justice system trained on this language, because at the end of the day, the children who don't make it in 4th grade often are in our juvenile justice system, undiagnosed, not given what they needed before, and not given when they enter prison. We want to change all that, and there are initiatives between UCSF and UCLA right now on this. So finally, I want to just change the whole concept of dyslexia. What helps dyslexia helps everybody. All this research goes into schools, it goes into parent groups, it goes into state initiatives, national and global issues. We want to change all this so that we understand that dyslexia is
this is the bag of
learning challenge, a learning difference that helps all of us do a better job with our teaching. And so with that, I will end with this new conceptualization of dyslexia and a psalm that it's always meant so much to me. The stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. That was true of Leonardo da Vinci. That is true of my son. Excuse me, I'm getting out. My son, Ben Wolf Noam, and I hope it will be true, ever truer for the students that you teach. So thank you so much. Godspeed with all of your work.
Thank you for joining us in this Reading Warrior session today. I hope you enjoyed the information shared by Maryanne Wolf. Of course, for those of you who were able to attend the session, we had a question and answer time with Maryanne to directly address our concerns around this issue. We hope you'll join us on November 30th for our next Reading Warrior session with Laura Reinhardt. She'll be discussing social justice issues around special education placement and services for students with reading learning disabilities. The talk will also describe ways to reduce referrals to special education, especially for groups that are overrepresented in special education in our K-12 districts. Registration is still available for this session. Please visit us at uclacrlp.org for registration and more information.